It's very simple. It's not a Ukraine war. It's not a war for territory. It's not a war against Ukraine only. It's a really global conflict where we see the key question whether we will have more empires or less empires in 21st century, and it concerns everybody. And it's not only about Russia right now. We see other powers willing also to become empires. And living in the world dominated by empires is very bad.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of On the Edge with Philip Ittner. Our guest this week is Volodymyr Yermolenko. He is a Ukrainian philosopher. He is the editor-in-chief of Ukraine World. He is the president of the Writers Association PEN Ukraine. And he is also, among so many other accolades, the anchor of the podcasts Explaining Ukraine and Thinking in Dark Times, and we'll include links in the description down below. I've wanted to speak to Volodymyr for quite some time because I wanted to discuss what's at stake here beyond geopolitics or global security, international relations, the war itself, the seizure of resources and land. No, what I wanted to do was talk with Volodymyr about what's at stake in terms of ideas. Do we really want to hand the world over to the way things are done in Moscow? It is certainly something that the Ukrainians themselves believe is worth living, fighting, and dying for. Why is it we can't explain to the rest of the world that you too have skin in the game? Increasingly, the world is becoming smaller. We are increasingly becoming more interconnected. So, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want to pass on to future generations? Because the answer to those questions might be being decided now, here in this Ukraine. Volodymyr, I appreciate you coming here to the studio to talk to us today. And I've wanted to have you here for quite some time because I want to talk with you about some philosophical issues, some ideological issues that exist between Russia, Ukraine, and the West and America, something that I don't think a lot of people recognize. I think they only look at this as a global security issue or a land grab by Moscow. But there's an ideological difference here. There's a difference in cultures. Can you tell me, Moscow would have us believe that this is all one country and that there is no difference between Ukrainian identity and Russian identity. This is just Malorossiya, little Russia. Explain to folks, what's the difference between Ukrainians and Russians?
Thank you for inviting me. So it's a long story, but to make it very short, I think here we have a political culture which is bottom up, which is very much decentralized, very much pluralistic. Mm-hmm. And I would even say anarchical. So here people, and I'm not saying now, I'm saying like for centuries, mm-hmm. even if we go back to the medieval times, to what we call Rus, mm-hmm. the medieval state centered in Kiev, even at that moment, the level of, what we call freedoms or what we call self-organization, what we call certain pluralism, political pluralism was quite high. While the Russian political project, for me, it starts after the Moscow kind of reverses the power relations with the Golden Horde, with
the Mongols.
With the Mongols, yeah. And it happens in the 15th century. And starting from the 15th and especially 16th century, they are grabbing the fragments of the Golden Horde and they are building the empire very, very quickly. And to build an empire, they actually, which covers lots of territory, they needed to renounce and reject this idea of republican politics, community-based politics, which they had. They had actually in Novgorod and Pskov, these two northern republican cities. But when Novgorod and Pskov lost their battle against the Vladimir, Suzdal, and then Moscow, then they started building this empire on the fragments of the Golden Horde. And now we have this huge difference, which goes back to very, very long time.
Well, I've heard it said, and I would be interested in your response to this, is that Ukraine is multicultural as a result of conquests that have come through it, powers that have passed through in the empire. Of course, there was indigenous peoples here, but Ukraine has become multicultural and has the establishment of democracy because they do have this presence of these different ethnicities, whereas Moscow has become multicultural by expansionism, by imperial growth, seizing lands. The conquest I refer to in Ukraine is conquests of people moving through. Moscow's conquest is how they ended up being multicultural. I wonder if you would respond to that kind of the difference in how
I think I would agree with that, because
that developed.
Even if you look at for example, if you look at the way how Ukrainian intellectuals perceived Ukraine in the 19th century, when Ukrainian state didn't exist and when Ukraine was divided between two empires, the Russian Empire and the Habsburg, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, well, the territory they had in mind was almost the same as we have now. It included Crimea. By the way, it included part of Russia, current Russia, which is Kuban, where people still speak Ukrainian. It included the regions of Kursk, for example, where people also speak sometimes, a language which is close to Ukrainian. But even if you like go to the medieval times, to the Rus, for the Rus, these like the territories going up to Danube, to the southwest of the territories going up to Crimea. Crimea is a very important, place for Rus, as we know, and the places like where now the battles are going. Like, ask yourself where geographically. So one of the most known medieval text of the Proto-Ukrainian literature is a poem about the Igor's how to say it, the Prince Igor
Igor.
battle, Slovo Polku Igorevim. Where it happens? It happens basically around the river Siversky Donets. So basically where now the fight is going on. Siversky Donets is that eastern river where you have all the towns that from the current history, like Izum or Chuhuiv or Svetohirsk, etc., up to Donetsk itself. So in a way, yes, Ukrainian history is the history of more or less of different power struggle for this land, without Ukrainians thinking of something else and conquest of other lands, while the major idea of Muscovy initially of the early 16th century, the idea of the Third Rome, this mythology of the Third Rome, by which they reacted to the Turks conquering Constantinople and the fall of the Byzantine Empire, was the idea of conquest. You're right.
Yeah, well, and for my mind, lots of folks don't recognize this as the birthplace of the identity of Rus. It was only because a bunch of bagmen for the Mongol horde who lived in this little provincial town called Moscow, because it was easier to give tribute there than in Kiev for the Mongol horde, that they were the ones that now have adopted the name Rus, Russian.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, I always try to explain it to people outside of Ukraine. And I say, look, the migration of names is a very typical thing. You know it. Because I talk to Germans and say, okay, but look at the medieval maps of the I don't know, 11th century, and look how the German lands. Maybe I'm mistaking about the exact timing, but look at how the German lands were called when the Carolingian Empire was broken. They were called Eastern Francia because they were the kingdom of Franks, and
Yeah.
Frank was the Germanic tribes, and the Carolingian Empire was an empire of Franks. So should the French say right now that if you were called Eastern Francia at the time, you should be part of
I think
France?
I think residents of Berlin or of Dusseldorf might have
Yeah, or ask a question how,
issue
for
of
example, didn't you think why the Greeks in the Donbass, so the Greeks transferred by Catherine II, deported after Catherine II, the Russian empress, conquered Crimea for the first time at the end of the 18th century, she deported a lot of Greeks, and she deported them precisely to the lands where the battlefields are now, the southern part of Ukraine, southeast of Ukraine. So how these people call themselves? They call themselves Romei or Urume. Romei means the Romans. But why they call the Romans? Because they were Byzantine Empire that was considering itself as a Roman Empire.
right, the second Rome,
yes.
of which Moscow considers or
So
aspires to be the
does
third.
it mean that people living in, for example, in eastern Ukraine right now and have Greek origin have to come back to Rome and say, this is our city? So it's all this talks about migration of names is sometimes so contingent.
Well, it's history, and it's a complex history. I've been coming here for 30 years, and I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface. How much do you think that this history that we're talking about informs and has developed into where we find ourselves currently, that Moscow is looking to reassert its empire, and first and foremost, in order to do that, they need to reestablish dominion over Kiev?
So in Russian mythology, they cannot accept the fact that they existed only through the early modern times, and they existed thanks to the Golden Horde, thanks to the Mongols.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, it's very difficult for them to understand and to accept. And therefore, they started to build this mythology that basically they're coming from Kiev and from Christianity. I think the religious element was quite important here. So in a way, there are several elements in which Ukraine is the origin of Russia, historically, because Christianity came to Russia from Ukraine, but to Ukraine it came from Byzantium. Then you can say that modernization of Christianity came to from Ukraine. Then the idea of a centralized state came from Ukraine and from the Ukrainian intellectuals during the Peter I reign. And there are lots of other things. So in a way, it's a very interesting thing that they build their ideology as if they are the highest, the biggest brother, we are the smaller brother.
Mm-hmm.
But psychoanalytically, it's always important to apply some psychoanalysis to politics. Psychoanalytically, I think they still feel that they will be headless or heartless, or I don't know, armless without Ukraine, without Kiev, as if their mythology, their very mythology of Russia, which starts from the Christianization of Rus, doesn't hold. And they lose like half a millennium of their history. Well, bad for them, because, that means that they're so much enrooted into the past that they cannot really think about the future.
Well, yeah, I think you're right there. I also think that having something like the holy the Pchersk Lavra here kind of is a double-edged sword, because they desire to acquire it for their origin story, but for us it's also a good thing, because perhaps that means they can't carpet bomb it. So, but I want to also talk to you a little bit about Russia's objectives. I don't think is just about territory. This is ideological. This is a historical dialectic. This is them and their identity, their sense of self. And in order to attain that, they have to. There are a couple of things in Russia, and I want to get your response to this. There are a couple of things in Russia's history that I think are being played out here, and one is the dream of Peter, when Peter dies, he says to Russia, "You must become a great naval power." I was I went on my basically Rumspringa around Europe, and saw that empire needs a navy. He saw Britain and the Dutch. He said, "I want to do that too, but in order to do that, I need a warm water port." So Russia, on his deathbed, he says, "You must find a warm water port. That's a major pursuit you must have." Then we have Catherine's, acquisitions on the northern shores of the Black Sea, and of course, finally, that fundamental idea of the Third Rome. If Putin wants, in order for Putin to survive, he needs to meet that criteria. He can't deny the dream of Peter. He can't lose the conquests of Catherine, and he can't abandon the concept of the Third Rome. How important do you think this is in his aspirations to take this land?
I think there are two aspects. The first aspect is very deep historically that you mentioned, is that indeed he feels himself as a heir of three figures, of Stalin, of Peter I, and of Catherine II. And in a way, he tries to do what they did, but in a kind of a reverse order. He starts with the concept, with the project of Catherine II, and as you rightly said, return to the Black Sea. And this is what he started to do with annexation of Crimea and then annexation of more and more territories. Basically, his major idea is, of course, to take all the northern Black Sea in his hands, and of course to control the Caucasus as well. Now, the second project is Peter I, and this is a very worrying sign for European Union and for NATO, is of course the Baltic states. And I do think that Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are in a big danger, and Poland, because of this ambition to get the Baltic states, to get the access to the Baltic Sea. And here, I mean, the Baltic Sea, just look at the map. The Danes understand it very well. If Russians want the Baltic Sea, that means that Denmark is in danger, because Denmark keeps the keys out of the Baltic Sea. The same way as the Turkey keeps the keys out of the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And therefore, we see that it will be very important, on the one hand, how the Nordic European countries will react on that, and how Turkey will react on that. Because if we are coming back to these geopolitical battles from the sea, that means that these countries should be worried, because one of the key story of the 19th and early 20th century is this Russian-Turkish competition, and for the 20th century as well, the Soviet Union and the Russia capacity and willingness to retake the Baltics. And we see the attack on Finland, and we see the Baltic states during the Second World War, etc. But when we're coming to the present time, I think his ambition is very, very simple. He thinks that he wants a revenge for Soviet Union defeat in the Cold War. That's very simple. And when he wants a revenge for this Cold War defeat, he wants to at least come back to these points where he was, let's say, in 1988, or let's say in 1945. That means control over the half of Europe. Yeah,
it should concern everybody. Obviously, this imperial aspiration is renewed kind of aggressive Moscow. When it comes to the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, having been here on Maidan, I think this was a seminal moment for Ukraine. I think this was when they really had this shift in mindset of, we're not going to be a colony anymore. We are going to seek our independence and self-determination. I mean, I was on Maidan. I remember people very much saying, because I've made this analogy before, and some of my Ukrainian friends don't like it particularly, but I'll make the analogy again, and you can respond to it. It has been a forced marriage, or a forced wedding, but a marriage nevertheless, even though an abusive one. And what Russia did during Maidan, and then subsequently when they started the war in Donbass and in Crimea, they used violence, and as any abusive relationship will know, once that bell has been rung, it cannot be unrung. The use of violence against Ukraine in the modern era, because of course there's a whole history of violence that Moscow's used against Ukraine. Once the abusive spouse puts hands on the abused, you can't stop that. So I got the impression on Maidan, and I get it today as well. It's only gotten stronger. Is we can't be together anymore. We can never be brothers again. As a poet friend of mine, Anastasia Dimitruk, wrote that poem on the Maidan. Мы никогда не будем братьями, ни по роду, ни по матери.
Никогда мы не будем братьями, ни по родине, ни по матери. У вас царь, у нас демократия. Никогда мы не будем братьями.
It's done, and I don't think Moscow gets it. They can't grok the idea, as it were, that once you put the violence in, it's an irrevocable separation. What's your response to that analogy?
Well, three things. First, the marriage analogy I don't like.
I knew you wouldn't.
And I will tell you
Sorry.
why. I will tell you why. First, I don't like the sexualization of politics.
Yes.
I actually talk about this in my recent book.
I am aware.
Eros and Psyche. Why? Because when we sexualize politics, that means we're politicizing sexuality. We're politicizing the erotic and love relations. I think they're totally different things. And Russians tend to sexualize politics. They look at the way how they describe the situation. They're describing the situation exactly in these terms, like Ukraine is an infidel wife, and we would rather apply violence to her in order for her to obey, sexually obey, and politically obey, etc. Now, another way why I don't really like this metaphor is that Ukraine is not a wife.
No, I specifically said spouse.
Okay.
I didn't. Because I've gotten that pushback on that a lot.
Because I will tell you why. Because in Ukrainian culture, we rather have, and it goes again very deep. It doesn't necessarily mean the ethnic Ukrainians. Like, we have this conversation with Timothy Snyder. It's very interesting. Like, ask a question why, for example, Amazons, according to Greek mythology, they were based somewhere here.
Mm-hmm.
Why, for example, in the Scythians' graves, we see the examples of women warriors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very interesting. That means that this space, which was very open to this big Eurasian steppe, and as you rightly said, there were so many people coming in, and there were, of course, so many conflicts. Everybody was fighting, both men and women. Mm-hmm. And this spirit of a fight is very, very important. Ask a question why the two categories of people, I would call them desexualized warriors. The Amazons, women who don't have men but who are warriors, and the Cossacks, men who don't have women but are warriors, come from this specific place. Because it's a warrior place. It's not a place of, wives who are serving their husbands or whatever else. But where you're right, certainly, is that the violence played a huge role. I think one of the points of the outburst of Maidan, and you definitely remember it. It was the 1st December 2013, after the students were beaten just several hundred meters from here. And then I remember that 1 million people was on the streets against this violence. So I think that one of the things that made Maidan stronger is precisely this rejection of violence. I think there is a big element in the Ukrainian culture of the rejection of violence, and this is a paradox of Ukraine. On the one hand, you have these warriors and the warrior culture coming from centuries and centuries. On the other hand, you have this, dream to live a normal life. But the problem is that there are always somebody coming from the east and from the north who are cutting this normal life from us. But the normal life means a very, very little tolerance towards violence. And I would not say that Russians, I mean, in the Russian point of view, it's precisely the violence that legitimizes them. So, in the Russian political project, starting from this 16th century and starting from the Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, a little bit later, I think the key topic is that only a person who is capable of extreme violence can be a real sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Russian political culture, if you look at the key topics, key figures of the Russian political culture, of the Russian leaders, people who are really form the pantheon, these are not soft people. These are very hard people who were killing a lot of people, including their family members. Peter I killed his son, Ivan the Terrible killed his son, Catherine II organized the killing of his husband, etc., etc. So I do think that Russian political culture is really based upon violence. I'm not saying that it will be forever. Probably they will invent something else. But precisely because of their dream of a greatness, of the big territory, they need to think how they stick all these things together. And it's only by violence that they put these things together. And therefore, they think that violence is a good management tool. Therefore, in their logic, they're still on the right way because they applied violence on Maidan, it didn't work. They applied more violence in 2014, it didn't work. They applied even more violence in 2022, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, this is their logic, unfortunately.
What are your thoughts on the Russkaya Dusha, the Russian soul? They're very big on, you'll never understand us unless you were born here because you don't have the Russkaya Dusha. I heard it when I was living in Moscow. I heard it. You'll never understand us, you Americans, you Westerners.
I think it's bullshit.
Yeah. I think
and I will explain you why.
Before you do it, I'll tell you what my take on it is. It's bullshit and an excuse to act deplorably. Drunken, violent, lazy.
Exactly. But I will tell you a little bit more philosophically. So by the concept of Russkaya Dusha, they actually understand the lack of, the inexistence of borders, the infinity.
Mm-hmm.
So they are it's an infinite land, very, very wide, the biggest on earth, and therefore they have the same infinite soul. So the soul without borders. But look, every culture has good poets or good musicians. I mean, ask you a question whether American culture doesn't have them. Like, don't you have great musicians? Don't you have great philosophers with this infinite way of thinking or feeling? But this is always like German culture obviously has it. You know, all this German mysticism, the French mystics, the British one, the Italians. I mean, the Dante. Is it not the question of infinity? But then I think the healthy culture says, okay, there is a place for people with this infinity complex or infinity fantasy, but there should be a place for people who care about borders, and who care about borders between bodies, between souls, between concepts, between ideas, between states. And here, when the concept of political borders is born, for the Russians, political borders does not exist because they want infinite land and whatever. So I think they're actually they're going to the extreme with this infiniteness, and this is their weakness. This is not their strength, because infiniteness, you have everywhere. In Ukraine, you also have infiniteness, but we also have this feeling of, okay, we have this in the image of a garden. This is one of the most famous Ukrainian images. You have to have your garden, which you care about. Garden is a nature under human and divine care. You need to care about this, but you need to understand very well what is the piece of land, the piece of being, what you care about. So I do think that this is Russian weakness, actually, that they're trying to present as a strength.
That leads me quite nicely, and I'm so glad you said that, because I knew this would be an interesting conversation, and I'm glad we get to talk about these topics. So wonderful to have you here. But I want to ask you a question that might not exactly be within your wheelhouse, but I think is an important topic to be discussed for my audience, of which are many American, but certainly Western liberal democracies built in conjunction with the American experiment. And a lot of people make analogies between Russia and America, both very large countries, both with access to the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, both multi-ethnic, multicultural, all sorts of commonality has been said by scholars and philosophers historians for a long time. But here's what I want you to respond to, and that is this. Yes, those commonalities do exist, but the fundamental inflection point, I believe, is that America, despite some of the sins of the birth of America, they forged their way into nature. This is a hopeful idea that this is an untapped land where we can go in and we can make this more hospitable for human beings to live. White European human beings, but let's put that aside for the moment. The idea of America, of going into an untapped land and making it your own, is a hopeful one. Russia's origin story is fighting its way out of nature, is fighting its way to protect yourself. And the very first thing they do when they go to a settlement is they build a Kreml. So it's a defensive line because the wolf is always out there. Nature's coming to get you. It is dangerous and it's coming for you. And these two fundamental ideas, one a society built out of hope and one of a society built out of fear. What do you think of my analogy
It's
there?
very interesting. Didn't think about this in that way. I think it's the idea of fortress is not necessarily bad because Europe is built on fortresses, And if you look at the map of the medieval Europe, like there is a map where you put a red dot on where you had fortresses. Basically, all the Europe, Spain, Italy, France, Britain, Germany, it's all red. And when Europeans are talking about how open Europe is, I'm telling them, well, you are open because at a certain moment of time, you were so much focused on building castles, meaning protecting yourself from each other, because you were so much endangered, that you developed this idea of borders that we talked about. And then this idea of borders turned into an idea of rights. Because first you build a castle and then you say, I'm a baron, I'm a knight. I go to the king and I say, I will not let you into my castle. This is my right to keep my castle, and therefore I have all other top sorts of rights. And therefore this idea of rights actually comes from feudal times, not very pleasant times in my opinion. So I don't think that building castles is a bad story. I think what Russians really lack is the capacity to build cities. The Russians lack the capacity of building cities in the ancient Greek way of thinking about, and then in medieval European the way of thinking about, because medieval Europe is all about cities, about German city-states, you can say, about Italian city-states. Like, look at the medieval history of Italy. It's very interesting.
Europe is much more dense, whereas you have this vast expanse of Russia.
Exactly, but then the question is, when you build a city, that means you build a community of people, and then inside the city, people do the self-governance. And therefore, in Ukraine, we very often speak about the so-called Magdeburg Law. We have even the monument to the Magdeburg Law. You know what Magdeburg Law is?
Oh, the Magdeburg Law.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Magdeburg Law, or the German law for cities, or the Wallachian law, which was coming from the south, is the law of self-organization. That means that whatever Tsar you have, whatever hetman you have a village or you have a town, and you have a mayor, and you are self-organizing. Of course, there are parts of power that are coming from the external world, but then very big number of power is coming from your community, and I think this is the most important difference between America and between Russia, between Europe and between Russia, between Ukraine and between Russia, because in Russia you don't have that. In Russia, the idea of power is always top-down, is always tyrant, is always despot,
vertical,
God,
binary.
Vertical. Yeah, exactly. In America, like, my favorite book about America is Tocqueville, of course, and I think he described it very well, how the sense of democracy was born in America. I don't know if it's gone or not. I'm really hopeful that it is not gone, and therefore the current attempts to impose the new tyranny are actually will fail, but it's up to you to decide, of course. In Europe, we also have this idea of, self-organization, etc. But Europe also knew fascism because of because people are tired of democracy, because people
It's
are
difficult,
tired. It's
yeah.
difficult because sometimes it's very slow. It becomes very slow. So democracies today are too slow, too bureaucratic, and they kind of they're too much in their rules and procedures, and they
Well, and you have to accept in a democracy that you're going to have to find common ground, and it's going to have to be a middle ground. It's unlike in Russia, where as I say, it's binary, where it's like somebody wins, somebody loses. That's always the way.
Exactly, and
for them.
in Russia, basically, you don't have this tradition of self-organization. So I think that's the key difference. Of course, there are similarities. I don't know. I mean, both nations, but I don't want to judge and go into your history. But of course, it's always the history of the relations with the indigenous population, etc.
Yeah.
But I think that's the major difference. Is not that they're building Kremlin or they're building the fortress. They're incapable of building the real city, the real polis.
Yeah, let me clarify a little bit more, because I think there's also another element to it, in that they come from a place where they have this fixation on like wolves, the wolf in the forest. I know the Germans have a similar tradition, but that nature is not other humans, but rather nature itself is coming to get you and is a threat to you and is a danger to you. Whereas, again, Americans went into nature and thought they could tame it, quote unquote. And Russians have this mentality of like, nature, if you let it, will kill you.
Or you should become, that's very interesting. But I think the logic is, and therefore I'm very careful, not even careful. I think it's very, very bad when politics is compared to zoology. Therefore, at 2014, I proposed the concept of zoopolitics to mark the Russian idea of politics, meaning that they literally identifying themselves with the bear. That means that, nature is so dangerous, but let's become like nature.
Yes.
Let's become as cruel as nature. Whereas I think the sound approach is that let's humanize nature in the way that we have. Of course, there can be wild nature, and we should preserve these wild elements.
It's why they have bears in their homes or in this. I mean, to integrate into nature is to be as brutal as nature is kind of their mentality. And I invited you here because I'm just a journalist. I live amongst peoples and I witness things and I kind of assess things. But as a philosopher and an academic, and I know you're also a journalist, but this is why I wanted to talk to you about it. This leads me to another line of discussion, in that I think when you talk about rights being born out of these structures, Russians look at Western liberal democracies and scoff at it as naive and hypocritical, that these ideas of inalienable rights are fictitious, that you are born into this world no better than a chicken or a cow, that you are born naked and weak in nature, and it is only by struggle that you gain rights. Whereas the American perception, born out of the age of enlightenment, is that you are born with inalienable rights. You have the right to liberty. You have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And even the philosopher, and I don't give him a lot of credit because I think actually he's an example of a larger movement that came about in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of trauma to the Russian world and this resentment. So Alexander Dugin, about a year ago, openly says, he comes out and he tweets this thing where he says, human rights were invented by Masons and liberals. And he goes on to talk about how it's actually kind of a state-run thing. And of course, these hypocritical Westerners only give rights when they feel like it. But it betrays something, I think, when he says this, in that there is an integral lack of understanding. They literally do not understand the ideals of liberal democracy, where it is no, this is fundamental. You have human rights. You are born by right of being a human and not a chicken or a cow, these rights. And I don't know if folks in the West or in America understand that very well, but that's fundamental to why I think this conflict is happening, because Ukrainians reject that idea, like most in the liberal democracy. Are you of the same mind that they simply don't understand this concept, this fundamental concept of basic human rights?
No, they're not that naive. I think you should take your opponent very seriously. Or in the case of Ukraine or Europe, or I don't know about America. In the case of Ukraine and Europe, it's an enemy that wants to destroy us. So we should take this enemy seriously. So the problem of liberalism, that is always utopian. So liberals were saying in the 20th century, look, socialism is utopian. And they forgot that liberalism is also utopian. And the capitalism is also utopian, because there is no such thing as free market. I mean, free market can lead to look at free market that we have. Look at the guys who are advocating free market. They're the monopolists. People like Elon Musk, they are advocates of free market. Why? Because at a certain moment they understand that they will win the competition for some reasons. I don't know which, technological or some others. So capitalism and liberalism have also the utopian character. And one of the utopian element of liberalism is precisely to say that everybody has the same rights. But we, from the reality, we know that it's not true. In reality, in our physical reality. But look, the smart people, like Enlightenment philosophers like Immanuel Kant in Germany, understood that very well, that one thing is empirical reality, that we feel, that we can sense. Another is our ideas and ideals. Freedom. Does freedom exist? We have all the data that will say that freedom does not exist, that we are determined, etc. But when we remove freedom as a hypothesis from our consideration, then we stop being human, because we will go and kill somebody and say, it's not me, it's something in my brain that determined that, and therefore how the concept of responsibility will appear or reappear. So freedom is something that is always there and always unattainable, and liberal rights for everybody is always there and always unattainable, and we should strive to attain them. But then the critics come and say, you are hypocritical. Of course it's hypocritical, because the liberalism is utopian, but it doesn't mean that it should not lead us to way step by step to get more of freedom, more of rights. Look, let's think about like ancient Greek democracy. Everybody knows that for Aristotle, for example, democracy would apply to a very limited number of people, very limited number of citizens. Not applying to women, not applying to slaves, not applying to children, not applying to not citizens of the polis, etc., etc. So the whole story of, let's say, idea of democracy is how you formulate a principle and then extend it to bigger number of people, bigger number of subjects. Like take the British liberalism in the 19th century. Why at a certain point it was very racist? Because these people were saying, Brits and French, for example, they were saying, look, the human rights belong only to us and not to those, other races, because because they don't have development, they don't know how to make history, they don't know how to talk, they don't have culture, etc. So at a certain point, you might have even the racist liberalism. And then, of course, all the history of the 20th century is the combating of this idea, saying that, look, yes, let's extend the application of rights. And now we have ecological thinking who is saying, look, probably let's extend the application of rights even to non-human world, to the nature. And then we will have a very interesting debate when we will have the first AI cyborgs and artificial people. And if you look at literature, very beautiful literature now written, there is a very good novel by McEwen, there is a very good novel by Ishiguro about the artificial people. And the question is the same. Are they real people? Yeah. But they sometimes feel and think better than us. So at a certain point, we will ask a question, people who are not born biologically, probably there as the same people as we are. So this is the the enigma and the mystery of this idea of rights, that you basically you can never apply it to everybody, but you try to extend it, because the alternative, and here I'm saying that I think you're not correct in saying that they do not understand it. People like Dugin, they perfectly understand it, but they want another world.
Okay.
They want a world which will be ruled by the rule of this strength, and the rule of humiliation and the rule of violence. That's the world they want to live in. They
Well,
want
go
to
back
build.
to this nature thing that
Exactly.
we were
Who is
discussing.
the stronger? Who is the more fit?
Well, I'll tell you a story. So when I lived in Moscow, this was a debate that I had and an argument that I had with my Russian friends and colleagues, and it just on and on and on we would debate this, and it was very frustrating for me because they've got a point. They got a point. We can be hypocritical. We can fall very short of our ideals. We can, they say, be naive. And I took all of this on board, and I was very conflicted within myself for many, many years. And then I came across, and I remember it very well. I was living in Baghdad, and it had been during the war, and it had been, about 5-7 years after I'd left Moscow. And I was still having this internal debate within myself. And I remember it clear as day. I ran across this quote from, if there is a secular saint within liberal democracy, one of them must be Abraham Lincoln. And I ran across this quote from Lincoln, which I include at the end of every episode of On the Edge for a very specific reason. And it's a quote from a letter that Lincoln writes to a childhood friend who is a slave owner. And it's called, it's the Speed Letter of 1855. And in it, he goes into a great many different topics about, should we have slavery and what does it mean to have slavery and all these other things. But he gets to a point at the end of the letter, towards the conclusion, in which he says, look, we started this country with the ideal that all men are created equal. And then we have hedged that. We have said all men are created equal except for Negroes in the parlance of the time, or foreigners, or Catholics. We say, yeah, everybody has liberty except for these categories. That perspective, because he's writing to a slave owner and eventually a member of the Confederacy, I would rather, he writes this in 1855, I would rather abandon the American experiment and move to a place like Russia, where at least they don't pretend the base alloy of the hypocrisy of the idea of liberty. That's in 1855, he writes that. And it was like a light going on in my mind. It was, yes, we're flawed. We're deeply flawed. And the ideals that we set for ourselves are very flawed. But what's the alternative that you offer? What Russia is saying is, give up on those. So the alternative that they offer is an abandonment of the hope of being better, of having ideals to aspire to. Yes, maybe utopian and maybe never accessible, but to abandon them is to fall into what the Russians do, and that is to say, brutality is brutality. It has always been thus, always will be thus. And that, to me, was the defining moment, and why I stand with Ukrainians, who I think also have aspirations to be better, to not live by the rule of the jungle. And that's what the Russians offer.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So it's always a question of human nature. Okay, if you're a composer and you're trying to make a song, if you're a good composer, you will always be dissatisfied. You will always think, well, it's not the ideal song. I should try better the next one. Or if you're a writer, it's what the Rousseau called perfectibilité, so our capacity to improve ourselves. And if we have this capacity, then of course our reality doesn't match our ideals, and that's the dynamics of history. While the Russian political project says no, we have to accept this social Darwinism, and all people are animals, and we just need to Fight against each other like animals in the jungle. You're right.
And whoever gains dominance gains
I
dominance.
don't want to live in this world. I don't know about you, but I would rather live in the world in which there are ideals which are not fully implemented, and then we discuss it very honestly, like where are the gaps, where are the flows, rather in the world who are saying all our ideals is bullshit, it's hypocritical, let's become animals, let's become bears, let's become I don't know, maybe, well, bears are better than than people who say we want to be bears, you know?
Yeah, or who can, who organize and conduct rape squads in their neighbors' territory. Yeah, I all of that I agree with 100%, but I don't think the West gets that this is so important or is such a crucial part of the conflict here. When the collapse of the Soviet Union happened and the end of the Cold War happened, Westerners, I think in their hubris, thought that, well, we won, right? So our system is the thing that will be going east. The Russians, they will adopt democracy. They will adopt the rule of law. They will adopt capitalism. All these wonderful things that we think won because of virtue of the ideals. We're the one that won. Our ideals will go east. What happened, I contend, is that the corruption and the brutality that was kept behind the Iron Curtain went flooding into the West. And we are seeing the ramifications of it now.
Absolutely, but there is one tiny detail.
Sure.
There is a Russification of the world. It's going on. Putinization of the world. It's clear. But there is always an alternative. And I think that Ukrainians or Georgians on the streets, Belarusians in 2020, Ukrainians now and Ukrainians in 2014, 2004, we are suggesting an alternative. And this alternative says, well, yes, totalitarian regimes sometimes are stronger. And I think I see that, disappointment in Europe and frustration in the United States. My message is simple: don't give up. Because probably we are now entering the decades where this democratic and republican idea that were democratic and republican, I'm saying not in political American terms, but as an idea, anti-tyrannical idea.
Got it.
Well, it was the establishment. In the 1990s, in 2000s, now it's no longer establishment, probably. It's no longer establishment in America. It probably will be no longer establishment in Europe and in some of the countries. And we will be in minority and we will be dissidents. But
Do you think that's an inevitability, or do you think that's what's being fought over here?
No, I don't think it's an inevitability. I think it's possible. And we should be prepared for that. And we should really understand that our ideas of freedom, first, they lose power, and maybe it's good for them because they need to reinvent itself. They need to understand that we are fighting for freedom not because it's comfortable, not because everybody writes about this in the press, not because there are, good institutions who give grants for equality or whatever, but because it's our values. And we might be entering the world where tyrannies will be very, very strong. The Russian, the Trumpist.
I think that's what this war is about. Yeah? I think this is why I'm here. I've covered over a dozen wars. This is going to be my last war. I'm sick of war. But if I never see another one.
Yeah, let me just finish.
Yeah, go ahead and
therefore,
finish.
This alternative to Russification of the world, Putinization of the world, and Putin is now suggesting this big idea, which is very, very small idea, actually. The idea says that violence is a good management tool.
Might makes right.
Yeah. Contrary to this, there is a Ukrainian idea, which is probably anarchic. It's probably sometimes very impulsive. It's very Maidan type. But this is the force that is able to stop tyrannies. And I think people both in America and in Europe and elsewhere in the world need to learn it.
I agree. And the point I was making with why I've come here and why I think this is, after a professional career of covering wars, I hope this to be my last one, but I came here because I believe that this is the most important war that I have covered or will cover, God willing, in my life, because this will decide the fate of the world. Do we go down the road of Putin's vision of the world, the Russian brutality, this aspect that we've been discussing, or do we hold on to the ideals of liberal democracy that Ukrainians are so desperately fighting for? Now, when it comes to the Russians, you talk about, like, does this reinforce Western liberal democracies to reorient themselves and realize what's worth fighting for? But alternatively, if the Russians are beaten here, do you think that it will, Snyder, you've mentioned earlier, is someone who says all imperial powers have to go through a loss of an imperial war so that they can reform themselves. What do you think about that idea? If they lose here, which I hope they do, but having lived in Russia, I know many Russian friends. I have Russian friends. We're not speaking right now, but I still consider them my friends. My hope, sincerely, and I know this is difficult for a Ukrainian perhaps to hear, but my hope is sincerely that the Russians get a drubbing here, that they lose their sense of empire, and without that sense of empire, they will have to return home, look in the mirror, and go, we have to change. We need to make reforms. For God's sakes, they know it. They know you put a couple of bottles of vodka into a Russian, they know exactly what the reforms are that they need to. For God's sakes, the Decembrists back in the early 19th century knew that reforms were needed, and empowering people was something that, if Russia was to survive and progress, that was going to mean. What are your thoughts on the idea of give these guys a drubbing, they go home, and maybe even they themselves benefit from a defeat?
Look, I think you're right that basically Russian defeats are good for Russian people, because the only episodes of real reforms in Russia were after military defeats, and the military victories were very bad for Russia. Like when Peter I won over Charles XII in Poltava, in Ukraine, he started building this horrible empire. When Alexander I has beaten Napoleon, the consequence was that Russia was a policeman of Europe and built this Saint Alliance, who was, with the help of the Prussians and the Austrians, who were, exterminating all the freedom movements all around Europe. When Stalin got a victory over Nazism, we had, well, it's of course a good thing, but we had a re-imperialization of the Central and Eastern Europe, and no reforms, no democratization. While when Russians lost the First World War, they had a short period of liberalism. Very short, when they lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, 1907, they received the first parliament, the first constitution. When they lost the Crimean War in mid-19th century, they liberated their serfs. Mm-hmm. When they lost the Afghanistan War in the 20th century, Soviet Union collapsed, etc., etc. So I do think that defeat in wars is good for Russians, for Russian citizens, because right now Putin is just slaughtering, of course, Ukrainians, but he's also slaughtering his own citizens, and nobody cares about this. Look at the losses of the Russian army. It's hundreds of thousands of people. Mm-hmm. Why? For which purpose? For another village in Ukraine, destroyed village? So you can ask a big question. And one of the paradoxes for your listeners, just to understand, one of the bad outcomes of this Oval Office episode was that Trump wants to impose the narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and it's collapsing. It's not true. No. Like, look at the map. I mean, Russians cannot do anything on the front line. Yes, Ukrainians have lots of losses and very tragic ones, but frankly speaking, 3 years into the war, no major city has been taken. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are dead. It's Ukrainians who are winning this war, actually, because we are protecting our sovereignty. Yes, we cannot yet take our territories back, But if you look from the perspective of 3 years ago, we won this war. We are winning this war. So you should not make this narrative that Ukraine is going to collapse. And coming back to your question, yes, I do think that Russian military defeat will be very, very good for the Russian society. They will save much more lives. But the reforms that I needed will be very painful. And I don't see how even the Russian opposition outside of Russia, in Europe or in America, is ready, except for some exceptions. There are some exceptions, like some of them. But they need to start talking about de-imperialization of Russia. They need at least to start talking, okay, let's make Russia a true federation. Like you have 80 or 90 subjects of federation, republics or districts or whatever. Let's make a government in each of them, the real government. Let's make parliaments in each of them. Mm-hmm. Let's make kind of a United States of Russia or the real... and then we will, and then let's see how it works, so that it's not a centralized empire top down, but really you have self-determination of nations, and you have kind of a and we'll see. I don't. Well, they're afraid of course. They're afraid that it will not survive, because such a big country without this very tyrannical power cannot survive. Well, but this will be a test whether Russia is real or it's just being held by a very strong tyrannical power.
Well, and they keep kicking the can down the road because they know this is going to be a difficult question. And you're right. In order to modernize and make these reforms, they may have to stop being what they consider Russian. I mean, the reforms, are they still Russian if they do decentralize? If they change the concept of society's relationship between government and citizen, between rights, with all these different things, are they still Russian? I got that from my Russian friends and colleagues all the time.
The problem is not Putin. The problem is the idea of Great Russia. Yeah. And as we talked when we first met, I think I proposed an idea. Of course, we have this concept of great, now very popular in America as well. But even in the English language, the word great doesn't mean the same thing as great in Russian, because the word great in English can mean cool. But in Russian, it doesn't mean cool.
No.
Great means great. It's veliki. It's just great. But veliki means that it's so big that you can be only small compared to it. So the idea of greatness presupposes that everybody other is small and every citizen is small. Therefore, we have this in Ukraine, mocking about this idea of malenькие люди, the small people, which floods the Russian literature.
Oh yeah, that's Moscow's, and it's not just here in Ukraine, but it's this concept of, and we get to decide what is Slav, we get to decide what is Orthodox because we are the great ones, you're the little ones.
Yeah,
it's that mentality that I think Ukraine is throwing off, and why I think back in the Second Chechen War, Joker Dudayev said,
В Крыму еще будет бойня. Украина еще схлестнется с Россией на непримиримых. Пока русизм существует, он никогда не откажется от своих амбиций. Вот сейчас славянская там под этой маркой хотят подмять, как и в прежние времена, опять Украину, Белоруссию.
I think we see that playing out right now. So let me ask you, as a Ukrainian, I agree with you. I think Ukraine is winning this war and will ultimately win this war. What kind of country do you want to build? And also including in that, recognizing that there are reforms that are needed here after years of being oppressed, colonized, and the trauma that we feel here, not only from historical and generational trauma, but the trauma we're going right through right now. What future does Ukraine want to build with all of that content, with all of this historical context?
That's a very good question, and it depends on the circumstances. It depends in which situation we will appear. For example, if Russia continues to exist and it's aggressive, we should build a security state with a strong army, with a strong military-industrial complex. And that means that we are building kind of a Hobbesian state. You know what I mean? Thomas Hobbes and the idea of Leviathan.
The Leviathan,
that basically the key idea of the state is security. Therefore, we invest a lot into security, I don't know, 20% of GDP, 10% of GDP, a lot. That means we don't have anything for welfare. So forget about the welfare state. Forget about this nice German type or Swedish type, I don't know, welfare state where you get good salaries, good pensions, etc. Therefore, all this gap of, state support to citizens is gone, and therefore everything should be decided on human initiative, on this Ukrainian type of anarchism, and I would say even libertarianism. So we will probably need to consider a part of libertarian idea, but not in the way how it's now reconsidered in the United States, but differently, absolutely differently, with an idea that, look, if the state cares about security, it cannot care about your pension. It cannot care about your jobless support. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So and
healing that trauma and those wounds will be that much more difficult if you don't have the infrastructure for that.
Absolutely. So it's a big question how far and what priorities do we put? And I think the key priorities should be, of course, on humans, on human development, on human capital, and everything like that. Therefore, for example, the Nordic experience is very, very important for me. The Finnish experience, the way how Finns, were living in a very insecure situation during the Cold War, and what they were developing, the way how they think about their education. I think it's very important. But I think we are very far away from it. I still think that Ukrainians are very good at freedom from, so we're very rebellious and and etc. But we are not very good at what Erich Fromm was calling freedom to. So meaning that creating precisely the institutions that help everybody or a big number of people at least to realize what they really want in their life, to realize not hidden probably, but the intrinsic values that they have and they want to implement in their life.
Empowering your people.
Yes, empowering, yes.
So as we draw to a close here, I just want to reiterate that I agree with you 100% in the terms that Russia struggles to take places like Chasiv Yar or Bakhmut. God forbid they try and take a place like Kramatorsk. But they don't have the capacity to do the two things that I think are essential for their designs on Ukraine, and that is they don't have the means to take Odessa, so they have lost dominion or sole dominion of the Black Sea forever. Again, what we spoke about with Catherine's expansion and her colonization of the North Shore of the Black Sea, that's a big deal for them. And secondly, they're not going to change the government in Kiev to one that is pro-Moscow. Those days are gone. Again, мы никогда не будем братьями. So I am still optimistic, and I hope that, that is a message that we get through to our listeners and our watchers. But is there something before we draw to a close that you would like to relay to a Western audience as a Ukrainian? I'd love to give you the reins, give you the platform. You got the microphone.
Well, it's very simple. It's not a Ukraine war. It's not a war for territory. It's not a war against Ukraine only. It's a really global conflict where we see the key question whether we will have more empires or less empires in 21st century, and it concerns everybody. And it's not only about Russia right now. We see other powers willing also to become empires. And living in the world dominated by empires is very bad. It means that there are clear hierarchies of people, and when you will be living in this world, you will remember all this liberal democratic hypocrisy as a fairy tale, as an El Dorado, where at least people were trying to be equal and free. So let's not forget it, and let's join our forces together. And Ukraine is not a problem in this case. Ukraine is a part of the solution. The way how we resisted, and the way how we don't give up.
Well, I am constantly humbled and privileged to be here and surrounded by people who are so determinedly optimistic and who have the strength and the character of the Ukrainian people. So I will be here as long as you will have me, because I think for the world to be better, Ukraine must be supported and has to succeed. And
Thank
there
you
has
very
to be
much.
an independent and sovereign Ukraine, which
thank
I
you
am confident will happen.
Thank you for
So
what you're doing.
thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for the time. Volodymyr Yermolenko. I still, after all this time, I still stumble on surnames. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you, Mitch,
Thank you
for
very
your
much.
input.
Thank you.